I'd like to thank the Minister and her challenger for coming. Over the next hour or so, we're here to shed a bit more light than heat, but if we want to have a bit of heat, then knock yourself out. I really encourage you to think about questions. Really 3 simple rules from me. Keep your questions, I want questions plentiful. They need to be short and they need to be to the point. Please do understand the difference between a question and a statement. A question is for this room, a statement is for the pub downstairs. And as I say, for the next hour or so, we're in your hands. I'm here to help you have a great debate and understand really the key issues of this coming election. Before we get started, I'd like to give each the Minister and her challenger, or Katrina and Steve, let's call it that, Katrina and Steve, a minute to answer a very broad and kind of question, or a statement really, about what you see, Katrina, as the key issues facing the food and fibre sector as we head towards this election.
Yeah, okay, well thanks very much firstly to the farm riders for hosting this debate today. It's great to be back with you. I of course had Christmas lunch with you in Parliament House late last year, so it's great to see so many people back again. It's been a fantastic 4 years in government, I've got to say, and when I came into the job, I was a little surprised because I had not been the shadow. We were just having that conversation, but I was shadow for natural resources, of course. So I inherited DPI, and there was so much to do, so much updating to be done, so much reform, critical reform, urgently necessary, that I set about embarking on a 4-year reform package. And there really is there are very few areas within DPI that hasn't been brought up to date over the last 4 years. Most recently, we produced our Agriculture Industry Action Plan, which is really a business plan for agriculture going forward. So that was produced by industry for government. A lot of work has gone into that, and as part of that, we are aiming for 1.5% domestic growth in the agriculture sector every year. It is ambitious, but I think it's really worth striving for. So we do have a business plan for agriculture in New South Wales. I am absolutely devoted to primary industries in this state, having come from a very strong family, farming family background in Yass in the southern tablelands of New South Wales. And I look forward to progressing on as part of a Liberal National Government after the next state election.
Thank you so much. Steve, some opening remarks?
That's good. Two major priorities that I would want to pursue if I am the Agriculture Minister after the election. First of all, is making sure that New South Wales can take its place in supplying food, particularly processed foods, to Asian markets over the coming decades. We need to be competing with Victoria and New Zealand, who are currently way ahead of us when it comes to exports to Asia. We need to be ensuring that our farmers have markets that we can help them to get into for the future, and that we can therefore expand our agricultural production and exports over coming decades. Second angle I particularly want to focus on if I am successful in becoming the Agriculture Minister again after the election is to focus on the quality of our soil in New South Wales, to make sure that we are working to improve our soil's water holding capacity, its carbon content and its productivity over coming years, and I think that's a focus which has been let go a bit over the last few years. There's a number of aspects of Katrina's opening remarks that I'd of course take argument with. The last 4 years have been very difficult for agriculture in New South Wales. We've seen significant cuts to services which have been very important. In particular, the dismantling of our extension officer system around New South Wales, something which was a pride of many people in our state. It's something that I think has been a really disappointing loss. And we also need, over the next few years, to try to undo some of the damage that's been done to land care particularly, and to many of our services through the LLS process.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you, Steve. Seems to me that we can split the questions into 2 very broad areas. One is very specific portfolio issues, so I'm thinking about the Native Vegetation Act, I'm thinking about drought policy, and then I think there are a host of other broader cross-portfolio, cross-minister and even cross-state federal election issues, or federal issues that really we'd be very interested in hearing what these 2 people have to say. So by that I'm thinking about Well, poles and wires, for instance. Are we going to spend that money or not spend that money if we don't have it, Steve? The issues of free trade agreements, obviously you touched on that. And the one that kind of gets a lot of heat is the question of how we balance mining and farming. So my first question really is a broad question, but to you, Katrina, to begin. What is a kind of rational policy response to the question of whether farming and mining can exist in places like the Liverpool Plains? What's a rational way to pick our way through this?
Well, what we inherited in this space was a big fat zero, so we had to develop a process by which there was a very rigid assessment of how projects should proceed, particularly in sensitive agricultural areas. So back for the first 3 years I held the water portfolio as well. Before that was very sensibly put into a natural resources portfolio, which combined with environment is actually where native veg sits too, just so that you know. I introduced an aquifer interference policy, the toughest regulation certainly in Australia, and one which went on to be developed as one of the toughest in the world. We introduced agriculture impact statements when it came to mining. There are a lot of checks and balances put in place, a total gateway system set up. And I do note that in the Liverpool Plains now that Minister Hunt has referred that again off to another independent committee for assessment for the water once again. I note that they assessed it a couple of years ago. But this is in, the community has had great concerns about this. That particular project is in the rangelands, not on the black soil of the Liverpool Plains itself. But there has been community concern about that, and I certainly always welcome very rigorous assessment surrounding that. So that announcement was only made a couple of days ago, and I don't know what the timeline is for that now, but it'll it is what it is, and it'll take its place.
I'll come to you in a minute, Steve, on this, but just so that we frame this argument. I mean, people who live and will work and rely on the food and fibre sector primarily want certainty. They want to know the policy outcomes are well considered, and then they want policies. What we see is the reverse. We see state mucking off to a committee, the feds having another go at it, referring to things. We don't seem to get clarity. How do you get clarity? How will your government bring clarity on this issue?
Well, we do have a rigorous gateway assessment process, I would say, but I'd also hasten to add that agriculture and mining have coexisted for the last 100 years. And in most parts of the state, very comfortably indeed. I know many, many farmers' children who work in the mining sector and bring home a great pay packet to their families that they support. It is a very important part of our economy. It produces the minerals and that we need in order to create our farming equipment. So the mining industry is a very important sector in New South Wales, as is agriculture. Now I'm the Agriculture Minister and I'm obviously very, very passionate about agriculture, but we need to take a view for the entire community when it comes to things like having to coexist. We have put in some of the toughest procedures in place with the gateway process that we now have in New South Wales. It never existed before. We had 5 ministers work flat out over a 2 or 3 year period to get that gateway process in place. Environment, primary industries, we had the Premier involved, the Deputy Premier, and the Minister for Mining, of course, as well, and Planning, of course, as well. So it was a very rigorous system. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of heated debate about it, but I think that the gateway process that we now have gives the mining industry needs certainty. It needs to know what hoops it needs to get through. But we also, as a community, need to know that there will be penalties in place for those that do the wrong thing, and those rogue operators just won't even get a Guernsey. Okay. That's where we are. Okay,
Steve, your mob were in power for a long time. You had the same issues, again, the same sort of outcomes. Why will your lot, if Labor gets in at the end of this month, be any different?
Well, mining and farming can certainly coexist, and I agree with Katrina on that. We certainly need both industries in New South Wales. I guess what we're saying very clearly is that we feel that the SEP, which the government introduced, which sought to elevate economic benefit on the assessment of mining above the other factors, was wrong. We felt that it should be economic assessment, economic impact should be equal with the environmental impact when it came to assessing mineral developments in New South Wales. We've made that very clear. Katrina talked about the gateway process. Gateway processes were starting to be in place under the last government, but it's pretty clear that they're not working at the moment. There isn't a single project that has stopped because the gateway process said stop. So at the moment, all that's doing is extending the process out, making it more uncertain, getting the mining companies to spend a hell of a lot more money, mind you, on their planning and assessment processes. But it's something that isn't working effectively.
So you get rid of it?
We'll release our planning policy soon.
Good day to do it today, I think.
My view is that the gateway processes aren't working properly as intended for the mining industry at the moment, or for agriculture, because the idea of them, in concept, it's a good idea. To say to somebody, we're going to have a look at this project without you spending millions of dollars on the full assessments, and tell you not to go ahead if we don't think it's a goer. At the moment, the industry just says, oh, well, thanks for that, but we're going to go ahead anyway, and they spend the money. So, that starts to raise expectations. The planning system is still running on the system that was there before the last election, with changes to the set, but with one critical difference. This government has now decided that it would make the PAC the decision-making body for all planning, and has taken away the minister's discretion in those processes. Now, you can argue whether that's a good or a bad thing in the long term. My personal view on that has been for a long time that that reduces the ability of voters at a ballot box to influence planning projects.
Quick response?
Well, I mean, Mount Penny is just a classic example, isn't it, where the minister held all the power for the mining leases and abused that power. I mean, this is why we need
Katrina,
an independent...
that wasn't planning, actually. That was actually the awarding of exploration contracts. And
but that's why we need an independent, rigorous process.
We're going to get nowhere if we talk over each other, okay? Nowhere.
That's why we need an independent, rigorous process, which we can say, look, this is truly independent, and for them to make the recommendations in that space.
Okay, just quickly, final question for you, Steve. Sorry, can I just ask a question? You've talked about you're not that happy with the gateway process, so you're starting to formulate, I imagine you've already formulated your response, your alternative. Can you outline perhaps to this group where you're thinking, where your head's at on this?
Well, our planning shadow minister will obviously outline our planning policy, so I'm not going to do that today.
But you have input.
But certainly we have a number of issues in planning. But fundamentally, the existing legislation has been shown to not be corrupt. The existing planning legislation has not had any negative findings out of ICAC. Where the negative findings were actually about the issuing of licences for exploration. And Labor came out very quickly and said that we would implement all the ICAC recommendations in that area, and so we should. The issue there was that a minister used personal discretion, which was allowed in the legislation at the time, against the advice of his department, and that's abhorrent behaviour, which I certainly would not have put up with.
Okay, we're going to hold that there. I mean, please think about questions around this, because there's a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about this than I do, for sure. Poles and wires, Steve. Let's just dwell on that for a second. I know it's not quite your portfolio alone, but just talk about it in the broad. In the broad, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, your mob is opposed to the park privatisation. Katrina's mob will spend $1 billion on roads and $1 billion on water infrastructure. So, and let's assume that's a damn good thing. Well, you can talk about that in a minute, why it is such a great thing. But, so you're going to deny the farm sector, the rural communities of this state, a $2 billion shot in the arm.
No, we're saying...
You are, aren't you? That's it, by opposing the... Well, you are.
You just asked me not to talk over
Katrina. Sorry. Well,
over Katrina.
But I can talk over everyone.
Hang on, I haven't started yet.
That's my job. Okay, go on. Tell us why you're not.
Labor is opposed to the sale of poles and wires. There's a number of reasons for that. It is a natural monopoly infrastructure, and in rural New South Wales we know that there is not going to be a competitor in the provision of poles and wires. That means that every consumer of electricity in rural New South Wales would be at the mercy of a private owner of the poles and wires. Now let's look at how much you can actually spend out of infrastructure. The government says it's hoping to get a $20 billion fund out of poles and wires. It's more likely to get around $11 billion, if that, from the sale price. It's actually spent the last couple of months talking down the future value of the asset to try and pretend that it's not going to get revenue coming in the long term. Labor can commit a $10 billion infrastructure plan over the next 10 years on the basis of the revenue we get at the moment and not reducing some company taxes. It enables us, and my understanding is that over the next decade, the state would spend around about $150 billion normally on infrastructure anyway. So let's remember this comes on top of other infrastructure. We will be able to provide an infrastructure fund of which 30% goes to regional New South Wales, rural New South Wales, and